Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be joined by Stephen Dinan, who is the founder and CEO of the Shift Network, which is perhaps the biggest platform for courses in the human potential movement, in wisdom. It's had, I think I'm right in saying, over 100 million customers.
3 million customers.
What
Our
is it?
goal is to touch 100 million people, but 3 million people participated in something. So
3 million people participated. Okay. Like me, Stephen has been shocked by what's happened to our culture during the pandemic. And he wrote a fantastic essay in July 2020 called Anatomy of a Delusion: How Otherwise Conscious People Descended into Darkness. And I think this was a really in-depth, point-by-point anatomy of what's gone wrong with our culture from someone who's really at the forefront of that culture. So it was very, in some ways, it was heartening to see. There was also disheartening in how accurate it was in its analysis. But Stephen, thank you very much for giving us your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for all the work you do.
I want to get into this fantastic essay, The Descent into Darkness. So I think we both kind of saw this thing happening to our culture. You wrote, "What is it in our collective movement that has made such a large percentage of people susceptible to this descent into rather extreme positions, what some are calling conspirituality? This collective crisis has revealed serious design flaws that are corrupting the code of our culture and need to be addressed with patches or fixes." So was there a particular moment where you thought, in the last 18 months, when you thought, whoa, what's happening to our culture?
I don't know if there was a particular moment, but I just noticed like on social media feeds, always trying to swat different things down. Like, oh my God, I can't believe this person is thinking that. Or like there were people that I started to feel like I needed to cut off from, or they were just putting out stuff that was, that actually had to dissociate from completely. And
like what?
And it was like Plandemic as an example. Not well, but a new Mickey Willis, and I was just like, oh my God, it's like they got to remove any association with him again, because I was just like, I think it was a journalistic disaster and scientific disaster, but it's like slick filmmaking, and it's just so riddled with falsehoods that it's appalling. And I just felt like Mickey is somebody who has been part of our movement and kind of a charismatic, tends to be countercultural filmmaker, and not somebody I knew well, but I had kind of a light touch at a distance with him, and it was I found it just appalling that was it's like that film is going to kill tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, because it's going to seed this deep distrust of all of what the people are getting, and then it sort of parks them in a sort of a deep suspicion of all these realms of knowledge, maybe rather than trying to integrate all of those and to see where they lopsided. And everyone is lopsided. It's not like the media isn't lopsided, but when you just distrust the whole thing, it's all just one big conspiracy. You end up in this little evolutionary eddy where you get really reinforced with other people who have the similar belief systems, but you're actually cut off from all the other wisdom streams in a substantial way. And so you end up with this, it's sort of almost like a righteous little side cult or something adjacent to the culture. And it really, I think it not only does it destroy the credibility of our larger movement, but it really offers a pathway. It offers a pathway that denies the validity of vast amounts of skilled skilled scientists and journalists. And I'm just like, oh my God. And so absolutely. I think when that went viral, I was just like, I just like something has really gone direly wrong.
It ends up in a kind of paranoid semi-psychosis, distrusting any kind of established authority, the police, the state, other people.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it's fed by, this sense of, and I think, again, so looking at the distortions is in order to form this emergent culture, if you will, the emergent culture, which is more global, more holistic, more integrated, there's a certain differentiation from mainstream, I think, that happens. Sort of like when kids get to adulthood, they often go through a period of rejecting their parents, right? Because it's like you're differentiating, you're establishing your own center of gravity. Eventually, you sort of come back into some sort of integration. But but without that coming back into a healthy integration, you end up in a kind of a, it's almost like an ideological adolescence, like where you're sort of like pushing, denying any validity and casting aspersions on this whole huge worldview of people that have real gifts. And so I think that at the root level, part of how people have found validation is, oh, we're part of the transformers, we're bringing the new dawn, there's a sort of an ideology of the emergence, which is attractive, but it has its own narrative power to sort of enthrall you to being part of this little subculture. So there are things about creating that subculture identity that don't lend themselves to actually capital T truth discovery, but more about creating the social cohesion of that subculture. And, and we're part of this too. Sometimes, and so I try to be really careful of language, because if you deny, like, you have to feed a little bit this desire to have a community of people who are pioneering a new possibility together, without denigrating the old, without disrespecting some of the other systems. So journalism, as an example, it's like, your average CNN article is much more thoroughly vetted and much more thoroughly based in a rigorous process that has a whole history and lineage behind it, and students, than almost anything your kind of average new age person is going to share on their Facebook feed. But then once people are suspicious, oh, it's all just mainstream media, and they start repeating mainstream media is filled with lies, then they actually lose access to the expert filtration, the expert knowledge accumulation that has been built around journalism. And I think science as well. It's like, I was trained in science. And so, people who really have no background or ability in science, who think they've done their research and they watch one or two videos. And I was like, have you looked at have you actually read the studies behind this and this? And, and sometimes people have MDs and they look like really compelling on video, but then you go and track the study they're referencing, they're completely referencing it wrong. There's also a lot of bad propaganda, and which is why science has been so effective over time. It's sort of slow moving, it's boring and dull in certain ways, but it has a kind of a momentum towards truth that's rigorous, because there's a policy of critiquing and peer reviewing. And I think that scientific mindset is really important for our larger movement. And so many people just split off from it. And it's like, oh, well, the only thing I really trust is my intuition. I get everything directly from the divine. And so you've cut off from this whole realm of knowledge building and accumulation. And I think that ends up delegitimizing our movement. It also leaves people, the number of people who have, been really taken down by COVID in our supposedly new paradigm community, because they're just simply not paying attention to the actual experts in this area.
Really?
Like frontline COVID doctors are just completely mystified, because people are like, well, I feel like it's not natural to take a vaccine, and I just trust my intuition, I'm healthy, and then they're taken down.
You're saying a lot of kind of new age people have been hit very hard by COVID. I mean, I know they've been spreading it a lot, but also has it been taken down quite a few people?
Well, I mean, that's the Delta is basically, it's like, at the end of the day, not many people are going to avoid Delta, because it's just super infectious, and it's very high transmissibility. And so it's going to get into every little nook and cranny and all these little, tiny little counties around the world. And so people who are in denial about, who think it's all a hoax, or it's all been engineered, they're probably going to get it at some point. And most of them probably will live through it and be fine, but a good percentage will still have long-term brain damage and brain fog. And I think that what also is troubling to me is that there's been a way that in the sort of the alternative world, there's been an overemphasis on self, like, well, my immune system is fine. Well, actually, but it doesn't even matter, like, in many ways, because you're just a transmission point for this virus to replicate. And so even if you're fine, the next 20 people down the line from you may not be. So you have a little responsibility for potential death down the line, or long-term chronic fatigue syndrome, or whatever it is. And people just aren't thinking about that. And that in itself is a mark of moral immaturity. When you're only thinking about yourself, that's a lower level of development. That's not like a transpersonal or a mature global world, where you have to take the viewpoint of other. Like
100%.
I've never been particularly concerned that I was going to go down with COVID, but I was like, damned if I do not want to be a transmission chain to my family and to other people or my parents and other, it's like, and so, that part of the equation is like, I wear a mask for other people, not just for me. It's almost gotten left out of so much of the alternative world discourse. And it's just a focus on the self, on your individual
Stephen,
self. And it's selfish.
And you in your essay, you highlight 6 systemic weaknesses in the culture, in the code. The first one is actually the overprivileging of the individual over the collective. And this totally rings true to me. I've seen sovereignty has become a big buzzword in spiritual social media. Sovereignty, and it's kind of libertarianism, personal freedom. It's kind of spiritual libertarianism, kind of New Age Tea Party a little bit.
I haven't heard that term. That's funny though. I'll use that, New Age Tea Partyism.
But so why is that? Why is there this overprivileging of the individual over the collective in our culture?
I think that there's, like I said before, there's been some differentiation. So people get disillusioned with the culture in which they've grown up in or feel isolated, sometimes marginalized. So then they go off on a spiritual quest, an adventure of self-discovery. And oftentimes can be a more solo process initially. Then you start to find, collaborators, people who are like-minded. You go to a festival or Burning Man or whatever, you start to find more people who think similarly. But what people, I think, the residue that they take too long is that this focus on individual enlightenment, liberation from structures. Whereas I think the mature spiritual perspective has to look at the good of the whole. How do you design the whole for the greatest good, for the greatest number? It's a kind of an immaturity that gets reified because some of these subcultures are, they're built around getting freedom from something. So it's like sexual constraints. So let's just sleep with everybody. Let's let's do drugs all night, let's party all night. Like there's like a breaking down of a certain social code in order to free yourself from that. But then it doesn't get back into reintegration where you're like, oh, I want to honor the social systems and all of the churches and businesses and politics. It's like there's a social glue and fabric that people end up in this kind of countercultural rebellion and they simply reject. And because people haven't really created something new that they're then cultivating and honoring and growing. It's like, as an example, it's like being the CEO of the Shift Network. It's like I'm beholden to so many people now, and we have 78 employees and all these contractors and hundreds of faculty and thousands of. So it's like there's 10,000 people every month who buy something from the Shift Network. So it's like there's all these people. It's a whole network of. I have all these social responsibilities, and the idea that like my decisions are just my private decision about my sovereignty is just not true. And so it's easier to believe you're just a sovereign being when you're on a beach in Hawaii, and that's all you're doing is just focusing on your personal growth. But ultimately, you got to build a better society too.
Right. And you have this great novelistic description of a type of character called the flow boy. You say the flow boy is often exceptionally good at dancing, romancing, and wandering the world. They eschew commitments, often champion polyamory, and economically don't tend to build much of enduring value. They pride themselves on how conscious they are, but when it comes to employment, family, or institutional and civic responsibilities, they are basically evasive. What happens when a global pandemic comes along? The flow boy blows it off, calls it a hoax, dabbles in conspiracy memes, dismisses the control of the mainstream. He is addicted to his freedom to do what he wants. Right. I mean, God, I think we've a lot of people in the spiritual world have a bit of the flow boy to them. So,
well, no, I mean, in some ways, I don't want to just make it about other people. It's a tendency in our culture as part of that freeing up of old patterns that you want, like, instead of like being regimented with what a society is defined, you find your own unique expression. But then it goes too far, and all you're doing is just following your own good. But I have good friends who are like, oh, you see me as a flow boy?
But it's interesting. You're talking about liberation, and it's like, it's so true. If you look at the history of spirituality, I mean, I've been writing about Aldous Huxley, and there's often a rejection of nation and the idea of patriotism, you know, like D.H. Lawrence, Aldous Huxley, this kind of thing. I belong to no nation. So it's that kind of expat mentality. There's often a rejection of the family unit, the nuclear family.
Right.
And there's also rejection of belonging to any one religion. You know, I don't belong. That's backward, right? I'm free floating. But then, as you say, that can end up to a kind of being evasive of attachments.
Right.
That you can get that.
Oh, I mean, and it drives particularly the women crazy. That's why I said flow boy, because there's so many conscious women who are like, can I just find a guy who is like, who's not couch surfing and isn't talking about polyamory and is like willing to kind of be a responsible dad. And like our culture isn't great at producing, like over our subculture is better at freeing people from patterns than building the new patterns. And which includes responsibilities and commitments and boundaries and containment, which rather than just like the kind of Rajneesh, like just blow it all up and throw up your hands, you know?
Now in your new book, Sacred America, Sacred World, you confess that you were a flow boy in the past, and that your father-in-law, who was more conservative, called you on this, and you had quite an argument with him. I'm talking like 15 years ago or so.
Good memory. Well, I wouldn't call it we had a kind of an email war.
An email war, and
not really highly recommended to do with your potential future father-in-law, but I had written a book about, you know, I wrote an article about after 9/11 around fierce love, and basically, can we take right action as a country without like just demonizing the terrorists and all of that? And so, and he decided to go to war with me, CCing all of his friends and family. So there was a little bit of that, but
while you were wooing his daughter.
Was like there was kind of two things conflated. One was like I asked him to mentor me in business. He was a tough, strong business guy who had been very successful. And I asked him to mentor me in business, and he said, no, you're too much of a wimp. And that was kind of how he talked with me. And I said, well, what would convince you that I'm not too much of a wimp? So I think that was the pivot right there, is that instead of just like being righteous, like, oh, I'm not a wimp, I'm just a more conscious flow, I'm going with the flow. It's like, I was like, no, if I'm going to ask him to do something, I'll see what does he think I have to do to prove that? So he said, if you can survive 3 months of mixed martial arts, of street fighting, I'll mentor you in business. And so I did like a year and a half, you know, boxing, grappling, Muay Thai, like it was, you know, and it was fun. It was interesting. It actually did build a different set of capacities. And he did mentor me in business in some substantial ways that led to shift. And so the takeaway was more like each culture has its virtues, if you will. And if you're just in the conscious new paradigm culture, there's a tendency to get overly feminine, overly flowing, less committed, less kind of like tough in certain ways. And that can be a problem when it comes to starting a company, as an example. And so I think of culture as almost as like they're gifted in certain set of skills, and they tend to have marginalized other ones. So our dominant, you know, we create this secondary conscious culture, but too much of the time it's a rebellion against or rejection of the mainstream culture. And then it tends to go way off in the other direction rather than a more integrative approach, which, you know, I've been there myself. So I'm not saying it's foreign to me.
Are there flow girls?
Oh, sure, they're flow girls, but I think that it tends to be the flow girls. I would say, you know, it's a similar pattern. It's a little less, I don't know, somehow less dramatic or something when the girls are into it, when women are into it, because it's a little bit more like they don't want to settle down. They don't want to be, you know, it's like, oh, I want to stay in my flow this weekend, or they don't want to kind of make a plan. They don't necessarily want to, you know, there's a tendency to sort of like prioritize what your impulse is at any one point in time over anything else.
Okay.
And I think that can lead to some real healing, you know, on the positive. It's like when you allow yourself to follow your own impulse versus a societal agenda or another agenda, you can have some real healing experiences. But if you spend 24/7 just following your own impulses, you're probably not going to make, you know, much of a life for yourself.
Right. So the second systemic weakness you identified was the tendency to deny the validity of other points of view, even ones that are rigorously acquired, and to overprivilege your own, even when it flows from just feeling a certain way. Makes total sense. Now, I can see some historical reasons for that. I guess the New Age kind of emerges from Romanticism, and in Romanticism, you get a big emphasis on intuition as opposed to, scientific ways of knowing. Like what Ralph Waldo Emerson says, trust thyself, and you get that in Blake and so on.
Which has a really there's a healthy and beautiful component.
There's something to that, yeah. But you
also, but then it's like, again, it goes too far where you then be like, oh, well, those scientists who have gone through 20 years of school and rigorous practice, like they don't know anything. It's like, I have my intuition.
Sure. Pipeline to God. D.H. Lawrence made Aldous Huxley laugh once by saying, I don't believe in evolution. I don't feel it here. And Aldous says, it doesn't matter where you feel it, But then you also identify market forces in the New Age. You say, best-selling authors in the new paradigm arena, unlike more conventional researchers within a university setting, are rewarded for two things that become problematic. One, expanding the explanatory power of their insights to realms in which it may not be applicable. And two, delivering their insights with surety that they are absolutely right. So what you're talking about there is really, spirituality brings out the hustler in people, right? Because we're all...
There's definitely... the truth is, it's like people are trying to make a livelihood. And so they often will, it's like the old saying, it's like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so whatever the framework of understanding it is on a personal development level, people start believing that it's the cure all, it's the be all, it's the end all. Yeah. And when they speak from that place, a certain percentage of people are just enthralled with that and they buy it. It can be more compelling. Like if you're really sure when this is going to deliver for you. And it's like, so it's a subtle thing that builds up over time, but because I've worked with hundreds of faculty members and thousands of thought leaders. And, I kind of see it as like, it's like a blessing and a curse. Like there's a blessing in the sense that a leader is tasked with bringing in a certain body of information that is important. But they tend to get so into their body of information that they overgeneralize and think it applies way beyond it does. Where science kind of beats people down the other way. It's like, no, you're not overgeneralizing. Oh, your insights apply to African cichlid fish in their maturational cycle. So it gets so narrow. Whereas like people in the new paradigm arena. So it's a tricky thing because there's a blessing and a curse in it. And then what happens, I see it's less problematic sometimes in the leaders, but then what happens is it starts to replicate in their followers, and then they parrot certain things that become new ideologies, and they just take it for granted. Like, oh, well, just, it's just like you create your own reality, or like whatever. So it's like a statement like you create your own reality. Well, it can be useful to think that way in certain realms, but you don't, if a Mack truck comes down the road and hits you, it's like you didn't just create that Mack truck. There's a lot of forces propelling around in the world. And so we are influencing our reality. We're helping to, create the pathways for our reality. We're interpreting our reality in different ways, but creating everything, no, we don't create everything whole cloth, because there's all these other locuses of consciousness that are also doing their creations too.
So on the kind of the science issue, one of the topics that have been most divisive for our culture has been vaccines. And I mean, I know that these are friends of yours, but I felt that, first of all, I know that you're a big supporter of Marianne Williamson's presidential campaign. And she got a lot of stick 2 years ago for her stance on vaccines. She hasn't really said anything about it since the pandemic started. What do you think? Do you think that that was unfair criticism? Do you think that she?
Well, I think vaccines can be a tricky one to unpack, and I'll tell you what my perspective is, and I think it's more nuanced than most of what I see out there. I think that vaccines can be a great societal good, and we are vaccinated against COVID. And I recommend anybody to get vaccinated against COVID, because I think the consequences are dire enough for our society. And it's really the only pathway out. And the actual studies of the secondary effects, I think, are way so far below the potential benefits to society that I think it's like our moral duty to do it, if you will. However, we also have, I do think the vaccine regimen for our children is too much too soon. And that we've tripled the vaccine regimen from the time I was little, and there aren't really good longitudinal studies around the accumulation and stacking of vaccines. So sometimes the kids will go and they'll get 5 or 6 vaccines in one office visit. And there's something that's particularly appalling that is just not widely known, is that Tylenol lowers glutathione in your blood. And so it suppresses your liver function, basically. So when you take Tylenol and you stack some vaccines and take Tylenol and suppress the glutathione, that leads to like a big overwhelm of a lot of fairly toxic load material sometimes in a system. And with kids who have lower glutathione and other things, there can be a lot more side effects, and those tend to get marginalized. So a place like Cuba has very high vaccination rates, but they have very low side effects because, for instance, they don't allow any Tylenol to be given to kids. So what's happened there is, I think the truth about vaccines is that there are risks, and sometimes they're like with the Gardasil as an example, which is HPV vaccine. I think that's a terrible vaccine. Nobody should get that. It's super dangerous, and it prevents far less harm than it does. So I think it's a more nuanced conversation, but then because of these culture wars, it just turns into like, you're either vaccine or you're anti-vaccine. And so the anti-vaccine people know some of like the side effects, they might've seen it, and then they distrust the entire mainstream body. And the mainstream body, meanwhile, doesn't want to actually deal, I think, in a really thoughtful way sometimes with side effects, and just wants to make all vaccines all the time is great, rather than, right, what is the optimum amount? Do we want to have a vaccine every week, or is that going to create too much toxic load in our body? And is it worth the risk?
But right now, in this particular health crisis that we're in, do you think that spiritual leaders should speak out and say, get the COVID vaccine?
Yes, and I have. And I actually have thought, I haven't had time to do it, but I was going to get as many leaders as I could to sign on to a statement publicly and issue that and say this, I absolutely think for COVID, it's absolutely necessary. Will I get a flu vaccine? I'm not ever going to get a flu vaccine personally, because I just don't think, I think there's some bioaccumulation that's not worth it. And I do think, so I feel like vaccines are it's a more nuanced space than our public discourse. And I think Marianne is she's closer to probably where I am, in terms of the public, and there just frankly isn't any space for that more nuanced conversation, because it's a really charged topic.
Okay, so the third systemic weakness is a doozy. It's esoteric knowledge ego inflation. And this is, I think, again, fascinating kind of novelistic view. He said there's typically with seekers a period of soul searching that takes the form of moving down the social status hierarchy. So when you become a seeker, there's a bit where one becomes a bit of a bum and a laughing stock in terms of your conventional standing. You say, for me,
simply you just lose status. I mean, how many times people are like, oh, you're exploring this, and your parents like, we sent you to Stanford for that. There's a little bit of that in the culture. It's not,
and you're like, oh, on another retreat. Okay.
Yeah. So why are you doing
still
this?
Seeking?
Why don't you just get a regular job? What's wrong?
Yeah. So you said, for me, that took a lot of meditation retreats, global travel, and working at jobs that weren't reflective of the usual Stanford grad pay grade. I was probably 40 before I had a positive net worth, which is encouraging to hear. But then you say, because of that status instability, there's a little trick the ego does when other people look down on you. You find a way to feel superior to those looking down on you. In our space, that takes the form of being holier than thou, more evolved, and therefore more right in all things. I mean, this is totally true.
I think this one probably is most clearly pointing at myself and then other people as well. I definitely was like fully, I was more fully in this when I was feeling kind of like, it's like all these successful Stanford peers. And what am I, I'm wandering around in meditation, ashrams, and it's like, I'm broke and trying to do this.
Yeah.
So then I had to kind of inflate, and I'm so much holier than thou.
Yeah. And you one sees that big time. And historical roots to that as well. Like, I mean, New Age is kind of a form of modern Gnosticism, and the Gnostics were like, well,
Yeah.
we're the most spiritual.
Right.
But you see that in kind of, you know, I'm a light worker, I'm an empath, I'm a star seed, I'm not from the same
Right.
planet as you, this kind of thing. So you see that kind of
Oh
spiritual
yeah.
narcissism is there a lot, right, in New Age culture.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's certain part of the path, and I think it's just understanding it. But then it's where that translates into a denigration of knowledge coming from other
Right.
realms that can actually be damaging, like in a pandemic.
Now, let me put it to you that in the human potential movement we both love, there's obviously this idea of evolution gets kind of adapted to an idea that humans are spiritually evolving. And we see this idea going all the way back to like Richard Buck's cosmic consciousness and theosophy, and people like Aldous Huxley, Stan Grof, all the way up. So it's one of the big ideas in our culture. But is there a risk in that spiritual people think, well, we are the as you say, like the more evolved, we are the future humans. And you know, that's
Yeah,
that can
no,
be
I
a
think
risky
there's a
idea.
real danger in it, because whatever sort of feeling of inferiority or weakness you have, like that can help you avoid that feeling. And so I think where we always get into trouble is any ideology that helps us avoid something uncomfortable in ourselves, something that needs healing, needs attention. And so places where we feel small or insignificant or weak, and then we layer them over with sense of superiority, and that becomes problematic. And you know, it's a tricky one to fully unravel, but it is. I think it's just good to be aware of that. If we're on the outside of the social status hierarchy, we'll tend to kind of poof ourselves up.
And what do we do about that? I mean, I guess in a way, the last 18 months has been humbling for us in our culture. We're like, oh, we're not necessarily always where it's at. You know, like we're not necessarily the most conscious people or the most conscious culture.
No, I mean, I think that's probably the healthiest response, is that, like, you know, here is a time of great global crisis, and frankly, the New Age fell flat on its face. You know, it's like we were, as a movement, the human potential movement was virtually useless during this pandemic, except for like some, in terms of navigating, how do you navigate a global pandemic? It's like, well, there was a lot of denial of science, there was escapism, there was, you know, and, you know, I think there was a lot of ways that we could have served in a deeper way. And I tried to forward some of those and do some of that myself, but I would say, you know, it's like, I think we have to be humble. It's like, wow, it's like, there's some growing we still need to do as a movement. What are these areas that we still need to mature as a movement, so that in a time of crisis, we are the leaders that people turn to as like, how do we navigate this in a really thoughtful, wise, grounded way that protects lives, helps us advance. And you know, I just didn't see much of it, frankly. It's like I felt like overall it was, you know, I would give our movement a 2 or 3 on leadership in this time.
I'm afraid you're right. Yeah. The fourth systemic was the love and light. You talk about the love and light imbalance. This shows up in people who are ultra positive, focused on the good of humanity, which is good, the blessing in every tragedy and so on. So basically, it's a kind of massive positivity bias. You know, it's phrases like
it creates cognitive dissonance, because you have a huge positivity bias that everything is beautiful, it's unfolding for the greater good. And I believe that there's one level of reality where that's true, but it's like it's sort of a tension between one level where everything's unfolding according to divine, you know, plan, if you will, and there's some things that are really rough, and you have to kind of hold both. And so what happens is people will live in that space, and then they see really nasty stuff happening in the world, and it's hard to reconcile that with this love and light worldview. So then you start to bifurcate into, everybody is just love and light, but then there's just a few evil beings at the top who are pulling all the strings of all of humanity. And I think it reduces cognitive dissonance and gives people a storyline of like, we're the redeemers and we're just going to overthrow these evil overlords.
Yes. Okay. And you know what that makes me think of is like trauma as well, and spiritual bypassing. That there's kind of, wounds inside oneself, which one avoids by saying things like positive vibes only, nothing but love, find a happy place. And then that kind of bypassing of wounds in oneself leads to a kind of splitting where there are these kind of completely evil demons there and complete light workers here. I mean, that might be like 5 cents psychoanalysis, but I do think that there's kind of, in our culture, there is kind of quite a lot of trauma at play, and it does, you know what I mean, leads to those kind of attachment issues we talked about.
There's also a truth that a lot of people entered the human potential movement because of some trauma as well. So as a movement, there's probably as much or more trauma in the human potential movement than elsewhere, because a lot of times whatever created the rupture with conventional thinking, conventional ideologies was something that was traumatic. Rejection at school, abuse from a parent, a breakup, a betrayal, and things that created some lasting damage that required soul searching, introspection, deep excavation to start to heal. And so we don't want to minimize that, because I think that's the compassionate lens. I think there was probably times I frankly wrote that essay I was kind of all pent up. And I wrote that essay pretty much in one day, in one sitting. And it was a long piece of work, but it was kind of more cathartic for me. I didn't actually think about an audience. I only shared it with like 10 people, and then it just kept propagating out. And so it was there's a little edge of judgment in it. And where I think the more compassionate stance is understanding most of these distortion patterns are coming out of some unhealed wound patterns underneath too.
Yeah, I don't think it's harsh. I think you make the point that light and dark are in us, right? Like the line of good and evil runs through us. It's not like
there's a Solzhenitsyn quote about that. If only there was evil people, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If only there were some evil people out there committing evil deeds, and we could just get rid of them. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and who is willing to sacrifice a piece of his own heart. And
I feel that, like, because the New Age, it seems to me, rejected the Christian idea of sin and of evil, and you can see why if you grew up in a very judgmental church. But it leads us with a weak theology of sin in terms of our, sin in us. Like, okay, sin, maybe people don't like these words, but like of our own capacity for selfishness, evil, like real harm. That it's not just about your shadow, like. Everyone's fine with talking about the shadow, but like we can do real harm. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely true. I hadn't really specifically talked about the linkage to rejecting the notion of sin, but I think you're right on with that.
Okay, so last two of these things. The fifth systemic weakness is the kind of warriors battling darkness myth. You say there is a messianic quality that grows in folks because they can only see themselves as being love and light, who are the polarized antithesis of the elites who are clearly filled with darkness and hatred. And this taps into the kind of QAnon conspiracy. Have you followed that? And have you been surprised by how that's rather taken off in spiritual land?
Yeah, no, I mean, I followed it not in depth. I have like tracked all the missives and all of what they're saying, but it just as the kind of downstream from it, I've tracked more of it. And I think that there's, some people have said that whoever created QAnon has an expertise in game theory, and game theory is really good at this sort of like creating storylines of the kind of redemptive overcoming of obstacles. And so it's very good at creating that insider knowledge. And it's like, oh, you're part of this elite who has a secret knowledge and you're going to help be the redemptive force. And I think that, a lot of people also, there's this sort of quiet disillusionment with the culture as a whole, and they feel like they're little cogs in a wheel. And it's like, here's an ideology that gives them a sense of grand purpose and leads them into completely crazy stuff.
But I mean, in terms of like the allure of apocalyptic myths, our culture and human potential culture as well has talked about things like humanity's about to go into a kind of cosmic shift. We're about to transcend to a new level of evolution. I mean, I think of like, you were friends with like people like Barbara Marx Hubbard, right? And you know, I know that, like, what is it, 10 years ago, were you somewhat caught up in the hope and optimism about around kind of 2012 and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, we actually built around that. I mean, the intention was, let's declare this the birth of a new era. We didn't say like, oh, everything's going to change overnight, but like, let's instead of focusing on end times apocalypses, let's have a rebirth moment collectively. So I was game with that ideology. I think where the thing that I think is tricky is people intuit this dawning of a new civilization, and I think it's accurate. I think that's what we're here to do. But it's hard to have enough patience for that birthing process. And so the impatience translates into like tear it down versus like, oh, it's sort of, there's a gentle birth, if you will. It's like slow motion of this new consciousness culture.
Yeah.
But it's not like today, it's like the veils part and all of a sudden, you know, revelations happens and we go into some sort of ascended plane. It's like, it's a gradual evolutionary process, but we intuit in our consciousness, I think on a soul level, because we know we incarnated to be part of it. And then we're like, why can't it happen already? Why are we destroying our planet? Why are we doing this? And so then people start wanting to take a sledgehammer to the pace of reality. And then that turns into this kind of apocalyptic fantasy, if you will.
You're right. You're like, why isn't it happening? Some evil forces must be blocking it.
Right. So then you just blame it on some evil forces. By the way, I do have to go on to something in 2 minutes. So we have to go.
All right, sure. Well, look, then the final one is the idea that we create our reality. You know, you say that in you know, this is like the idea in law of attraction, which you found appalling. I mean, is that idea of we create our reality, isn't that the kind of bread and butter of New Age spirituality? Like, isn't that what you find in, I don't know, New Thought or in A Course in Miracles and things? I mean,
well, I think, you know, I think what's true is consciousness is causal, but consciousness is multi-local, and like we're all little nodelets of God. And so is God ultimately creating the entire fabric of the universe? It's like a shimmering vast net of intelligence that's creating new possibilities. Yes. Is Stephen Dinan's little ego able to create exactly what I want around me at all times? No, because I'm just one little tiny node out of this vast Indra's net of nodes of consciousness. And so there's sort of a disrespect of the creative unfolding of the sort of the individuated level of reality. Individuated reality, we have our own little separate selves that are tapped into the bigger field. And yes, we have creative power to create things, but we don't, it's not unlimited. You know, we don't, I'm not going to manifest, you know, sort of like a fountain of golden water in front of me, like just by thinking it. It's like like there's a kind of a sequential unfolding, and we can nudge reality in a direction, and sometimes we can get more and more effective at birthing the things we want, but it's not like a little magic wand. And that's where I think that a lot of those things were really kind of poor distillates of deeper teachings. Because they were just like so simplistic, and then it wasn't challenging people to have to grow and open the aperture of their being to a bigger perspective. And well, it's more like, how do I manifest the car that I've always wanted?
And just finally, Stephen, and thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed it. How do we go forward? Like, you know, what do we what are some practical steps that we could do to strengthen the culture? Is it about changing our attitudes, or are there institutional things we could do? What do you think? I mean, I think it's
a combination of both. I think it's good to import more of the kind of standards of ethics and care and concern that you have from like science and journalism into our movement. I know people who are working on different kinds of ethics bodies and accountability. I think it's building a culture where there's an allowance for debate and for calling people out rather than just going along with these things. And there's also, I think, a humbling of like recognizing like, okay, we just went through a big crisis period, and a lot of our compatriots and maybe ourselves weren't that helpful to our fellow humans in navigating that. And it's like, what do we need to learn and grow so that we can do better next time?
So it was great to talk to Stephen. He had to rush off at the end of the interview. So the one thing I didn't get to ask him about is his work and his writing on the relationship between spirituality and politics, spirituality and activism. So he has done quite a lot of work on that over the last 10 years or so. And I think that's interesting, and I wanted to talk to him about it because it's a question of how can New Age spirituality move beyond simplistic, over individualized and over spiritualized reactions to problems in the world, like, oh, just, you know, think happy thoughts or emit love, and things like climate change or, you know, starvation or pandemics will disappear. And he's written a recent book on that called Sacred America, Sacred World, where he outlines a kind of left-wing politics for spirituality that takes diversity seriously, women's rights, indigenous rights. And he's organized big events recently on kind of climate change and getting people like Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson to talk about how we can cope better with the threat of climate change. So that's interesting in the terms of how to make spirituality less solipsistic and selfish and individualistic. I guess what I was interested to ask him is, you know, he talks about politicizing spirituality, connecting it to politics. And obviously that's partly from his, you know, his father was the city attorney in Duluth, so he has that kind of politics in his blood. But I wonder about the marriage of spirituality and politics, like the marriage of religion and politics, and whether there is an appropriate line or separation between the two sometimes. You know, you look at, say, Christianity in America, what happened when evangelical churches became very political in the 70s, 80s, and up to the present day, and it, you know, formed the religious right, and that really ruined the church and exacerbated polarization. And now, in a way, something similar is happening in the New Age. There has been a political awakening within the New Age, but it's been to the right and to the far right, in fact. You know, so you have yoga mums suddenly becoming awakened during the pandemic and disappearing down the rabbit hole of QAnon, or getting really into Trump and so on. I mean, I called it the kind of New Age Tea Party. So in a way, spirituality has become more politicized, as Stephen hoped, but in a very different way to what he imagined. So I don't know if the solution to that is a more left-wing kind of spiritual politics. Certainly that's what he's trying to build with people like Marianne Williamson. So we didn't get to discuss that, but it was great to discuss a lot of other things with him. You know, as I think you'll agree, he's got a very interesting take on it, and it's just good to see senior figures in the culture stand up and talk about what's gone wrong in our culture, and to take responsibility for it and to suggest ways forward. So if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video.